So I feel motivated today to speak about something that we experience, especially as finance leaders leading global operations across multiple countries. And this has to do with process standardization versus local flexibility. So if you ask me, the biggest risk in multi-country non-profit operations, I always don't see it as fraud or donor fatigue or currency volatility. Currency volatility can be a big thing, and we'll talk about it in my subsequent videos. But usually I see it as the process confusion that is disguised as empowerment, and I want to dig deep into this. And I'm saying this after 2 decades in nonprofit financial leadership across organizations operating in multi-country jurisdictions with multiple funders and very different regulatory environment. So I've seen well-meaning flexibility quietly erode control, but I've also seen rigid standardization suffocate local effectiveness. So today, let's talk about the tension nobody actually really likes to admit that it exists. How do you scale governance, delegation of authority, and risk controls across multiple countries without becoming chaotic or even coming out as colonial? And by the end of this video, I'm going to give you a framework that I use, and it might challenge how you think about standardization altogether. So I want to call this the real problem. When nonprofits expand across borders, one question quietly shapes everything. Do we centralize or do we localize? Most organizations treat this as maybe a binary decision. Head office says we need uniform processes. Country office says you don't understand our context. And then the finance, who is supposed to be the implementer of this, ends up in the middle trying to enforce controls without being the villain. So here is what I've learned. The problem is not standardization versus flexibility. The problem is confusing control with uniformity. Uniformity says everyone must do it the same way. Control says the risk outcome must be the same, regardless of how it's achieved. Those two are very different philosophies. And if you don't separate them, your governance structure will either become performative or oppressive. So let's take governance first. So in multi-country operations, governance has layers. We have the global board, regional oversight or country oversight. Then we have country boards or advisory committees. We have executive management, and then we also have donor compliance layers. On paper, this looks sophisticated and well set. But in practice, it often creates duplicated oversight and diluted accountability. So I have experienced circumstances where, for example, in an organization, a procurement approval requires the country director sign off, regional director sign off, and then HQ finance sign off. 3 layers, same risk, zero clarity. What that creates is not governance. Actually, for me, it creates hesitation. And hesitation is operationally expensive. And the conventional insight that sometimes the unconventional insight that sometimes I tend to bring is that at scale, governance must define risk appetite very clearly. And then once this is defined, they must then get it out of the way. So if your board cannot articulate what level of financial exposure is acceptable, what variance threshold triggers intervention, what constitutes a material breach, then they may be structural, kind of, ceremonial in the way they support your operations. So for me, governance at scale should ask 3 questions. 1, what risks are we willing to take? What risks are we absolutely not willing to take? Who decides when we cross the line? Who decides when we are close to the line? If those aren't crystal clear, delegation becomes like theater. So then let's talk about delegation of authority. The word most nonprofits like to use. And most nonprofits treat delegation of authority as a financial approval matrix. So we have dollar thresholds, signatures, procurement limits. But if you look at a multi-country environment, a delegation of authority should not just be a matrix. It is actually a cultural document, because here is why. In one country, 50,000 procurement may be routine. But in another, that same amount could present a year's operating budget, maybe under a sub-department in that country. So if you standardize thresholds globally without contextualizing economic scale, then you distort power. And so here's what I would recommend, and maybe this is a bit unconventional. Instead of standardizing amounts, standardize risk categories. For example, I would say, look at low risk recurring expenditure, high risk new vendor engagement, strategic capital investments, and restricted donor funding procurement. Then allow countries to calibrate thresholds within those categories, of course within the global guardrails. That shifts the conversation from why is your threshold different to are we aligned on the risk classification. That's more, I feel like that's a more mature discussion than just putting everything in one blanket, because delegation at scale must be clear, must be risk-based, must be context aware, and must be periodically stress tested. For example, you always need to have a period where you simulate a breach scenario to see how your delegation of authority actually is performing under pressure, because that's when you will actually know how it works. And so number 4 is also the risk control in multiple country operations. So you find that in this kind of setups, there are regulatory variances, there are currency exposures, there are banking systems instabilities. We also have talent capacity differences across countries, political risk, of course, and then we also have donor-specific compliance requirements across different countries. So most organizations will find themselves responding to this by increasing reporting. More templates, more forms, more checklists. But for me, I look at it in terms of reporting volume sometimes does not equal to risk control. In fact, if you ask me, excessive reporting sometimes may hide the risk, because teams will now focus on compliance formatting instead of the substance. So in my organizational financial credibility method, I tackle how to standardize controls objectively, but not necessarily control activities. Like, you need to learn that you can standardize control objectives, but you don't need to necessarily control the activities around them. For example, a global control objective could be all expenditures must be independently reviewed and auditable. So that is your global control objective. But how this is achieved may vary based on the digital infrastructure that you have globally and in country. It also may vary based on the staffing capacity that you're working with in country. It may also vary based on each country's or each geography's regulatory requirement. But you see, the control outcome remains identical. This distinction then allows accountability without rigidity, oversight without micromanagement, and protection without paralysis. And so here is one thing that most people actually won't say. Over standardization can create shadow systems. But when local teams feel constrained by unrealistic central processes, what they will do is they will create workarounds. And workarounds is exactly where the real risk lives. So process standardization versus local flexibility. How do we balance this? So here is a framework that I use. I put it at 3-layer level. So level 1 is what we call the non-negotiables. So these are the global standardized. They are globally standardized across geographies. And one is the ethical standards, globally standardized, anti-fraud protocols, conflict of interest policies, financial reporting principles, and audit rights. Those are what I call level 1 non-negotiables, and they must be standardized across. Then I come to level 2, where they are the guardrails. These are what I call globally defined but locally applied. For example, what I was talking about earlier, the delegation bans, procurement processes, vendor due diligence, and budget reallocation limits. Because global defines the risk boundary, but countries or local defines the operational execution. Then level 3 is the adaptive practices. So this is where now we become fully contextualized. So what are the payment modalities different from each country? Vendor sourcing methods could be different for each country. Staffing structures that drive this process may also be different across the geographies, and also the local compliance workflows. So this is now the adaptive practices that still follow the global standardized non-negotiables. So this 3-tier model prevents the two extremes: HQ dictatorship and also country level fragmentation. And most importantly, it protects credibility, because funders do not care whether your system is centralized or decentralized. They care whether it is actually controlled. So in closing, let me say that scaling a nonprofit across countries is not about replicating processes. It's about replicating the control integrity. If your system only works when your CFO is watching, then they are not scalable. And if your governance only works in stable environments, then it's not resilient. And if your delegation structure creates fear instead of clarity, then that is not leadership. And after nearly 2 decades in this sector, I can tell you that financial credibility at scale is less about complexity and more about disciplined clarity. So the real question for your organization is not, are we standardized? The real question is, can our control philosophy survive growth? So if this video challenged your thinking, you can subscribe so that we continue speaking about some of these areas in finance and strategic finance management, for that matter, that enable our organizations to grow and thrive. In my next, I want to tackle the issue of why many global nonprofits are more compliance ready to less operational shock ready, and most of them actually don't know it. So I will see you in the next, and thank you for watching.